I also wonder, because I've heard this from other people, how do we reconcile the fact that everywhere you went, you got enormous support for an anti-war position. I guess it was February 2003, many people in this room, in fact, were out in the streets protesting the U.S. invasion of Iraq.
Yeah.
The biggest anti-war protest in the history.
Millions of people.
Right, millions. And then we have this sort of radical insurgency. It's very clear, it's dynamic, it's mass, and here we are having this conversation under the Trump regime. How do we get there? In other words, so many of the movements that emerged, but 2011 was a dynamic moment around the world, and now we have a world where right-wing authoritarianism is becoming dominant. Now, I'm not saying that that's the end, and I actually totally agree with the anarchists call generative temporality. That is, that you don't even know what's going to happen. You've got to be in it to make it happen, and I really do believe that. But I just do want to play a little bit devil's advocate. Like, how do we get here? What do we do?
Well, okay. Trying to figure out how to not be as long-winded as I really want to be.
Oh, no, you got to. This is your show, man.
No. Okay. I think that since the new left, the left has gone away from class struggle and focused on focused on spectacle. And that's had a lot of detrimental effect to what our movements are and how. And let me explain this. And I'm going to be very general here, and whatever. But I'm going to essentialize. But in the 20s and 30s, you had, according to the documentary Seeing Red, you had in the 20s and 30s, you had 1 million card-carrying communists altogether, right? At the same time, you had militant strikes going on in Colorado and Alabama, Montana. You had at that same time, and some of those strikes were involving shootouts between, corporate hired guards and the workers.
Right.
You had at the same time in the Midwest, you had workers occupying factories. You had on the West Coast, you had the longshoremen who were thought of to be unorganizable, thought of to be less skilled than custodians, thought of to be less organizable because they're at like all of these different sites and there's a high turnover. They were getting you get fired every couple weeks or whatever. That was unorganizable. They were having a militant strike up and down the West Coast that involved the militia coming out and fighting them, and they were successful in that. You had at that same time, but unrelated, you had the bonus march happening where veterans of World War I hadn't got their bonus checks yet, and they marched, some of them armed, on the White House. Right. And were met by General McCarthy. That's when he started getting famous, because he met them with tanks. Right? Now, it was in that milieu, and mind you, there were revolutions happening all over the world, but in that milieu that we actually got the New Deal. It wasn't because people were like, we got to put all our effort into getting FDR in. It was because there was something that could have turned into a real revolutionary movement. It was that big, it was that widespread, and it was that radical. At that time, the FBI thought of Alabama and Utah as hotbeds of communist activity.
Well, they were.
Yeah, they were.
Right.
Those states that are now red, their grandparents were actually red.
Right. That's right.
And so it was in that milieu that happened. Now, soon after that, you had what was called the United front against fascism. And what that meant internationally, obviously, many of you know, was the Soviet Union, UK, and US joining together to get rid of Hitler. What that meant for radicals in the US has come down from the Comintern was, while the US is fighting Hitler, they can't be afraid of a revolution happening in the US while the military is away. So the answer to that was the biggest radical organization in the United States was the Communist Party USA, went underground. So during that movement before, not only was it militant where you had these strikes, but the leaders of it were calling for revolution. We're saying this is part of a larger revolutionary movement, which I think is part of what made them more popular, right? So now all of a sudden, these radicals were not radical anymore. They weren't revolutionary anymore. They were progressive. And they didn't tell you who they were all the way. And this was in the 40s. Mm-hmm. So,
and they suspended the party at some point.
Yeah, and so a few years later, you have the McCarthy era, right, where they could point at those same people and say, that person's a radical, that person's a revolutionary, that person's a communist. And they have been lying to you. And that part could be true, right? Where had it been 12 years before, they'd be like, I know. They were telling me about revolution as they were helping me get my, move my furniture back in while the cops were moving it out, right? Or when we did that work stoppage, these things like that. So because of that, and because of the non-action or non-critique because of that, and because of non-action and non-critique from revelations about Stalin, Communist Party broke up into all these little organizations in the 50s, which soon in the 60s became the beginning of the New Left. And the New Left, again, I'm essentializing everything, but the New Left took on a new tact. They weren't going to be like the previous period before. They were like, fuck you, I'm a revolutionary, fuck you, I'm a communist, fuck you, I'm a radical, right? The thing is that they focused on cities and universities. And what you can't do, a strike at a university is not the same as a strike at a factory. It doesn't have the same relationship to power. And so it became in the 60s about getting people onto the street. Mm-hmm. Whereas in the 20s, they were getting people on the street. They'd have 20s and 30s, they'd have demonstrations of 10, 20, 30,000 people, different things like that. But the difference was it was an actual demonstration of something. It was a demonstration of power. It was like, these 10,000 people that work in your industry are going to shut it down tomorrow unless you do this, right? It was connected to an actual material point of power. Starting in the 60s, it became spectacle, getting people into the street. And I'm a child of that way of thinking, to where I've been part of demonstrations and we'll have 10, 20,000 people out, be part of something, and the new people are like, yeah, what next? Right. And we're like, I don't know, lift your voice. Let your voice be heard. And in that way, we are also selling folks an incorrect idea of how power works, right? We're telling people that all you have to do is let it be known that you don't like this. Maybe if we get millions of people out on the street, we can stop the Iraq War.
Right, and of course it doesn't do it.
It doesn't do it because that's not how power works. Power is related to capital, and the people have the power to shut that down. And that's what it responds to. But I'll say that since the 60s, a lot of what we've been focusing on has been, with that new tact where it hasn't been about class struggle. Again, I said I'm essentializing. There are definitely examples in the 60s where some of those students were like, we're going to go
into the factories.
Yeah, we're going to go into the factories. We're going to do that. But this is for the most part. And we have our idea of what a movement is. When we say a movement, we all picture different things based on what we've read about, what we've seen on TV, what we've seen around us recently. And so the left doesn't have a base of power. The right does. It's the same thing with the music, with the groups with the African medallions. They don't have a material base of power, but the people singing about selling dope, there's a material base of power right there. So the right wing has the capitalist class and capitalism to back them up, and the way capitalism works right now. And we need to have that movement to back up anything we're doing. But one of the other ways that it went from people in the street is that first thing, we got millions of people in the street, turned into a pro-Kerry movement. Right? Turned into a pro-Kerry movement. And you had folks like that were my friends, like independentvoter.org or whatever. They had pamphlets out lying to people saying Bush is for war, Kerry is against war. As a way to get the anti-war movement to support Kerry, right? And the thing is that that's what happens in elections, is you have to sell it as this person is the be-all, end-all. It'd be different if this person fits into our overall plan in this way. But we're selling things as in that's what happens and that changes. Then anti-war movement dissipated for years and then came back up again just in time for electing Obama. My family was very involved in the Obama movement. The arguments we'd have would be like, we're creating this network of people. And it was definitely a grassroots network. There was a lot of good people on the ground, like doing stuff in phone banks and, and canvassing. Day after the election, it's over with. Right? Because this person is the be-all, end-all.
And who they elect, someone who's also supporting war.
Yeah. So anybody that you're electing, you're going to, exactly. Nobody was a lot of people that had spent all that time organizing to get him in didn't want to say anything. But, because he was the be-all, end-all. Now, the thing is that if you have a movement that can shut down industry, you can make any politician do what you want them to do. If you feel that getting somebody in there that's more aligned with those thoughts in the first place will help, that's cool. But the selling it like that's the end, that's the thing that kills the movements that we need.
Right. Yeah, no, definitely. We got 1 minute and 26 seconds left. So, because we could talk about this all night. There's so many things.
Yeah.
Even the issue about socialism really deserves a real discussion, because there are people who, as you know, would support socialism but not class struggle. In other words, socialism in their vision is simply a kind of...
Well, that's because they don't understand the fact that class struggle is going to be going on, whether we have a militant labor movement or not.
But if you think
it's
of
just we're going to lose
as just the New Deal, restoring the New Deal without the racist policies, then that's not socialism. And that's part of the issue. What does it mean to have power? Working people's power. Anyway, so that's for another conversation. So
you could just point to France, where they've got a lot of the stuff that is being claimed to be really radical. Here, they've got that, and they still need a revolution, right?
Yes.
Any of those countries in Europe. So far be it from me to say, obviously, these are reforms that would lift the burden off of everyone.
Absolutely.
Right. But the question is, how do we go for more.
Okay. So